Dr. Hyatt?
I'm just puzzling a little bit over switching to the efficacy side. Just the history of what got us here, so that I recognize if you go back to the approval of statin drugs, that this division has a history of approving drugs in this space because they change lipid parameters in a presumably favorable way. And it was later that the statin trials showed dramatic clinical benefit, and that was a great thing on your part to collectively make that decision to let those drugs on the market. Now we're in a different space of add-on therapy. We've had these discussions a few years ago around the fibrates, and as I sort of observed the data from this meeting, it appears that the sponsor, I think appropriately, has committed to a cardiovascular outcome trial, which is terrific, by the way. And I think you guys are doing a public good, no doubt, because of the wide use of these medications off-label or as supplements, and which is earlier discussed in the open public hearing. So my question to begin this thinking is has the division made a decision that these, if you're going to go beyond a triglyceride of 500 milligrams per deciliter, if you're going to get into this more kind of range where there are more patients, they're at risk, is a cardiovascular outcome trial really part of the program here? I mean, the label simply says this drug lowers triglycerides in people at risk, which literally is true. But in fact, the behavior would suggest that they're going to have to initiate, and they're in the middle of, a large cardiovascular outcome trial, which would imply to me that any new lipid drug add-on to statin would really need the same approach, which would suggest that a guidance might be forthcoming or something to help us understand a little bit more what's expected. Or are you just doing this because ultimately they want to have a label that says this drug actually works in terms of clinical benefit? And I guess I'm asking you all, where do you stand in this regard? Because literally, this drug does a terrific job lowering triglycerides. It makes the other lipid fractions look good, pretty much. But there's uncertain clinical benefit, and they actually have a trial launch to answer that question. So where are you in terms of the state of developing any drug that's add-on to statin to alter HDL or triglycerides or other lipid fractions?
If we just stick with this particular compound, remember that our discussions with the company started back in 2008, and we'd had conversations with similar companies in 2006, where it was primarily a triglyceride-lowering drug. And for a long time, people were getting the indication of severe hypertriglyceridemia over 500 based on just triglyceride lowering alone.
Right.
And if you read the guidances, most people agree that the first priority is to try to prevent pancreatitis. We've talked about, could we actually have a development program where pancreatitis was the endpoint? And I think that would be probably tough to do.
Yep.
But when we started to get into companies wanting to target this lower range of TG, it was clearly with the goal of selling it to reduce the risk for cardiovascular disease. So back in 2007, 2008, we weren't in a position to say, there's no way you're going to get this approved without doing a cardiovascular outcomes trial and completing it and then coming back to see us. We knew these other trials were ongoing, Accord, Aim High, Thrive. While not the same compound, we knew that they would add some information. So we felt it was very reasonable to say, look, do a lipid endpoint study for 12 weeks so we get to see what the lipid profile looks like. But we want you to at least have the cardiovascular outcomes trial up and running with 50% enrollment so that we know that even if we approve it now, it'll get done fairly quickly. And if the folks feel that it shouldn't be approved at this point, the trial's up and running and we still will get that data fairly shortly. I also think that if Accord Lipid and Aim High and Thrive were positive, I think we would have a different discussion today.
So I appreciate that. I'm still just wrestling a little bit with the only reason I could think of to lower triglycerides or raise HDL or change LDL composition, ApoB levels, particle size. The only reason to want to do that is to prevent cardiovascular events. I can't think of any other reason to do that. And by the way, I agree with you. It's hard to imagine an event-driven pancreatitis trial for super high triglycerides. I kind of smile when you think about that because that's just by inference that it's actually going to be good. We don't know that really. So the only reason to treat these mid-range triglycerides is to prevent heart attack, stroke, and death. So let me ask you the question another way. Why not require every new lipid drug coming on to be reviewed to demonstrate that it has a biomarker benefit that looks good, i.e. changes levels appropriately, but that's just a surrogate endpoint towards the actually clinically meaningful event-driven trial that then, like if you were developing a new antithrombotic drug, whether it's an anticoagulant or an antiplatelet, you'd be in the same position. It sounds like you've gone there, but it's not clear to me.
Well, you know, when we're dealing with compounds that, if you could call them more pure LDL lowering compounds, that's where we feel the most comfortable in terms of using that as a surrogate. I think the further we get away from LDL and start getting into TG or LP(a) or even non-HDL, and we have in place, if your compound is primarily raising HDL cholesterol, you do have to complete an outcomes trial before you can submit your application. So we do have that requirement for HDL raising drugs based on the recent experience with CETP inhibitors. But again, this was the first case with triglyceride.
Okay. So
this is a test case. And we weren't in a position back in 2008 to feel like we had the proper support and data to say to Amarin, there's no way you will ever get this indication unless you complete an outcomes trial. We thought there was enough uncertainty to give them the advice we did. And as it turns out, we've had additional studies that have been completed that I think do play into today's discussion.